That's good? Okay, great. And a little anecdote, you humanists, secularists, non-believers don't know this, but Ian has a deeply spiritual side, because I almost didn't get here. You know, I'm from LA. And at the 11th hour, I found out that I needed a passport. More on why it was the 11th hour later. So I asked Ian to join me in a prayer circle to ensure that I get here on time. And here I am. So thank you so much, and I want to thank Ian, for doing all the schlepping and the logistics. I recently saw a film called Dark Girls, which is a phenomenal documentary by a filmmaker called Bill Duke. And Dark Girls focuses on the global phenomenon of colorism, which is the cultural preference for dark skin over light skin. And there's an interesting sequence with an African-American psychologist where she talks about how, in her view, the whole notion of beauty or beauty standards is a fairly recent phenomenon from an African-American perspective, because for most of our history, we have been considered to be less than human. And so she cites a very powerful African proverb that says, until the lion learns how to speak, the hunter will always be a hero. And that proverb resonates in an era in the United States where the reactionary right has steadfastly proclaimed that this is a period of post-racial colorblindness, and that in order to reform, for example, American public education, we need to privatize, corporatize, charterize, and neoliberalize public schools, bust teachers' unions, and dismantle multicultural education. But throughout much of my American education, or all of my American education, no one ever handed me a book written by a powerful scholar and novelist like Toni Morrison of African-American descent, and said that civilizations rose and fell on her words, or that whole belief systems emerged from her teachings and philosophies. And similarly, no one ever taught me to believe that some of the world's greatest intellectuals and scholars came from where my ancestors came from: plantations, reservations, and contemporarily, barrios and so-called ghettos. So the focus of this talk will be on how to develop a culturally relevant feminist humanist pedagogy that's steeped in a critical consciousness that now, perhaps more than ever before, young people of color, within the American context, are fundamentally dispossessed of any purchase on historical agency. And that young women of color continue to be positioned between these two reactionary poles of identity, that of the Virgin Mary and the super slut, super hoe, Jezebel, brought to them by a corporate culture that wants to tell them that authentic femininity of color resembles, say, the Bad Girls reality show, in which African-American and Latina young women slice and dice each other for fun and sport, Grand Theft Auto, in which young women of color are gang raped for fun and sport, or hip-hop themes like bitches ain't shit but hoes and tricks. And so I cite these three examples because my students, high schoolers in South LA, cited these examples as being some of the most salient influences in their lives, pop culture influences. And I recently picked up Lisa Del Pitt's book, Multiplication is for White People. Lisa Del Pitt is an American progressive education activist. And the title reminded me of an exchange that I had with an African-American female student in one of my classes. This was at the beginning of the year, 12th grader, brilliant, should have been going to a four-year college. And we were talking about the impact of negative media representations on youth of color. And the class was very much engaged in doing media literacy, deconstructing these images from their perspectives, their cultural capital, their lived experiences. And when I asked them to define the word analysis, this brilliant young African-American girl pushed back and said, "Miss, you cannot expect us to know what that word means because we have not been taught on that level at this school." So 2 decades later, my experiences sitting in some of the very same classrooms in the Los Angeles Unified School District, which is the second largest American school district, are my students' experiences as they trip over the surreal fact that their ancestors, black and brown women and men, founded the city of Los Angeles in 1781, in this so-called city without a history, where undocumented Anglos were the, quote, real OG illegals. And a few years before, a new revolution in what it meant to be human unfolded on the opposite shore in the British colonies. My students know the romance of the American Revolution, but not the secret of Los Angeles. In the prison house textbook of history, they know each other only as enslaved niggers and wetback interlopers. Growing up in the same neighborhoods, elbow to elbow, cheek by jowl, they are taught to believe that black and Latino culture can be distilled down to media stereotypes, to get rich or die trying, hip-hop and ghetto dysfunction, to big Catholic families and job-stealing illegals. As kindergartners, they were taught to cite the Pledge of Allegiance as a sacred chapter and verse, hand solemnly over heart, in homage to royal theft. Founding myths of heroic white men, bootstrapping to liberty, are intimately bound to their imagination of the classroom, to its rhythm of shrill discipline and stench of brown chalk, to a regime of time in which white supremacy and narratives of exceptionalist progress are the currency of American faith. Over the past few decades, progressive education reform activists have reshaped the dialogue about the so-called achievement gap in public schools. Culturally relevant or culturally responsive pedagogy that builds on the lived experiences, cultural knowledge, language, and worldviews of children of color have become a standard, if still controversial, approach to redressing race and class disparities in education. Culturally relevant pedagogy rejects myths of meritocracy, colorblindness, and exceptionalism. But of course, after Barack Obama's election, the mainstream media trumpeted that this was an era of post-racialism. Racism was a thing of the past. There was a family of African descent in the White House. Sasha and Malia were the new girls next door, and everything was hunky-dory and utopic. But no one smeared Bill Clinton, disreputable Bubba that he was, as a bone-in-the-nose, bongo-playing savage, or the son of apes, or remig. This is one of the latest images that's been floating around on the web. And no one ever caricatured Hillary Clinton as an ape or a missing link, yet these were the images that emerged with a vengeance after the election, underscoring that the U.S. has not suddenly morphed into this colorblind post-racial utopia. And it's important to revisit these because some people have a little cultural amnesia about what actually went down.
Oh, we haven't even seen them yet.
Yes, you as Canadians may not have seen them. But revisitation is important because historical and cultural amnesia is the cornerstone of American subjectivity, particularly within a global context. So, the U.S. didn't suddenly morph into this post-racial paradise. And in fact, according to Public Religion Research, which came out with this really illuminating survey around the midterm elections in 2010, a majority of Americans believe that the United States has been gifted by God with a 21st century manifest destiny to democratize and Christianize the world. And a majority of those who identify with the Tea Party believe that discrimination against whites is now just as pressing as that against so-called minorities. The majority of those that identify as white Christian evangelicals believe that discrimination against whites is now just as pressing as that against so-called minorities. And this is another survey that came out in 2011, really indicating, how deep and intractable white views are on so-called reverse discrimination. But all of these elements underscore how the hyper-religiosity of the United States is deeply tied to this nexus of white Christian evangelical activism, white nationalism, and white supremacy. So what does it mean, given this toxic climate, to be an African-American humanist, feminist practitioner? What does it mean, particularly given the fact that Barack Obama is a very devout Christian, is very corporate aligned, is very centrist to conservative in his policies, has greenlit most of the Bush faith-based initiative regimes, but is still smeared, demonized, caricatured as this Tommy Pinko, infidel, socialist, savage, heathen. Well, I want to put this into some context in terms of humanist foremothers, if you will. In 1928, Nella Larson, who's in the middle, wrote her landmark book, Quicksand. And Larson was a Harlem Renaissance author. And Quicksand was one of the first explicitly skeptic black feminist critiques of the corrosiveness, in her view, of organized religion in African American communities. And so Larson's protagonist, Helga Crane, was something of an oddball nonconformist who bucked the black authenticity police, not only because she was a very frontal critic of organized religion, but also because she was a biracial young woman growing up betwixt and between Harlem, the literary mecca of black America from the 20s into the 40s, and Copenhagen, Denmark, the country of her mother's origin. And at one point in the novel, she travels to Copenhagen to hook up with some extended family and discovers, lo and behold, that she is fetishized as this savage, dark, sexual other. So she comes back in a state of deep disillusionment to Harlem. And in one particularly scathing passage, she falls in with a group of, let's just say, revivalists. She critiques what she believes to be the absurdity of African American observance of Christianity, particularly given the depth of black poverty and economic disenfranchisement. And so Helga muses that religious devotion was dysfunctional for black people because it, quote, blunted the perceptions. It robbed life of its crudest truths. Religion especially had its uses for the poor, for the blacks. How the white man's God must laugh at the great joke he played on them, bound them to slavery, then to poverty and insult, and made them bear it. And so there's a passage from Moral Combat. Helga's rejection of the Christian entreaty to take the possibility of redemption on faith, despite unrelenting earthly evil, misery, and suffering, becomes the catalyst for her retreat from religious dogma. After Quicksand's publication, Larson's probing exploration of the ministry was uneasily received by some. As a woman who, quote, did not believe in religion herself and was considered unconventional for the period, Larson defied the bourgeois prescriptions of black middle-class womanhood. Challenging religious faith bucked conventional gender norms epitomized by the sacrificial good woman. A recurring theme in both Larson's Quicksand and her 1928 novel Passing is the gulf between society's narrow expectations and our female protagonist's sense of self and subjectivity. In this regard, Quicksand is a stunningly contemporary indictment of black parochialism and moral repression. And so Larson was part of this vanguard of African American humanist thinkers that espouse secular humanist principles within the context of economic justice, within the context of racial justice. There was no line drawn between humanism and, say, anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism and dismantling structures of racial apartheid, both domestically and globally. Some prominent feminist thinkers besides Larson were Zora Neale Hurston, also a Harlem Renaissance author, as well as Alice Walker. And Alice Walker in particular links the context of African American women's resistance against institutionalized sexual terrorism to a radical humanist notion of reproductive justice. And so in her book, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, she asks, did you have a genius of a great-great-grandmother? What did it mean for a black woman to be an artist in our grandmother's time, our great-great-grandmother's day? Did this genius of a great-great-grandmother die under some ignorant and depraved white overseer's lash? Or was her body broken and forced to bear children who were more often than not sold away from her? 8, 10, 15, 20 children, when her one joy was the thought of modeling heroic figures of rebellion. And so in her short story, The Flowers, which was published in 1970, Walker also unpacks the nuances and paradoxes of black female subjectivity. in looking at the experiences of a young African American girl who's out picking flowers and happens upon the decomposing corpse of a lynching victim. And in very spare and eloquent prose in a short story that's about 2 pages long, she skewers the savage contradictions of a nation that has always put itself up as this font of individual liberty, as this beacon of civilization and democracy and justice for all, but has done so through the erasure of its savage dehumanization of black bodies and black subjectivities. And so the story concludes with a simple parting salvo, and then the summer was over, signifying not just the figurative end of summer, but the end of the possibility of innocence for this black child. And really bringing home to me as a resistant reader the regime by which to be a black child at any point in the U.S.'s quote-unquote exceptionalist history is to always be othered, criminalized, racialized, and embodied. And to be a black girl is to never ever exist within this vaunted, rarefied space of innocence, preciousness, or feminine beauty. It also underscores the travesty, contemporarily, of the fact that African American women are the largest female subpopulation in the prison system in the United States. About 30 to 40% of the prison system, or excuse me, 30 to 40% of the female population of the American prison system, the prison industrial complex, and also disproportionately impacted by intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and HIV/AIDS contraction. And so there is this deep and pernicious racialized gender gap in the United States. But the crisis that is specifically confronting African American and Latina young women is not exactly burning up the national radar. And so several years ago, out of my frustration with the lack of feminist, anti-racist youth leadership programming in the Los Angeles Unified School District, I founded the Women's Leadership Project in South Los Angeles. And South Los Angeles has gone through a sea change in demographics over the past couple of decades with the increase, dramatic increase of Latinos, such that the outcomes and the lived experiences of African American and Latina young women are increasingly intertwined, particularly in neighborhoods that are historically very religious and socially conservative, and where you may find a few churches on every block, as opposed to healthcare facilities, schools, parks, community centers, and other culturally relevant and responsive spaces. And so the schools where WLP is based have historically high dropout rates or push-out rates due to racial disproportionality in suspension and expulsion, the criminalization of whole populations of young people within the school district, large numbers of youth that are in foster care, that are English language learners, that are undocumented, and a large population of homeless youth, particularly lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth, that in addition to suffering socioeconomic upheavals due to the recession, are suffering from the lack of culturally responsive programming and resourcing that is sensitive to the nexus of heterosexism and homophobia. And so whenever we do presentations for WLP, we constantly get pushback about how come boys are not included in the program. And certainly we do a lot of cross-gender programming and organizing with like-minded groups on campus that are social justice oriented. But in my mind, this anxiety, if not hostility, emerges from this widespread belief that if we are talking about empowering communities of color, we're really talking about empowering boys and men, and that youth leadership initiatives that have an approach looking at this intersection of heterosexism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and racism are deemed to be threatening and culturally inauthentic to the legitimate mission, supposedly, of redeeming and uplifting Black and Latino masculinity. And so when young women of color appear at all within the national discourse or national radar, is because there's been a spike in teen pregnancy rates, or there's been renewed political rhetoric around illegitimacy or welfare dependency, a la the comments that were made several months ago by then-candidate Newt Gingrich, suggesting that there were all these shiftless, pathological, dysfunctional, unemployed African Americans waiting around on street corners for a plane to fly over and drop down social welfare benefits and food stamps from the Obama administration. And this was a pretty good preface to Massa Mitt Romney's recent comments about the 47%. The person who is basically the patron saint for corporate America, and robber barons, who has never met a tax shelter or a hedge fund or a capital gains handout that he did not like. And so criminality and illegality are stamped on the bodies of black and brown women from the get-go. And this is due to the amplification of this nexus of white Christian nationalism and Christian fascism on the one hand, and a certain strand of reactionary black and Latino nationalism on the other hand. The ramping up of the culture wars that is centered on anti-abortion and anti-family planning policies has the most insidious implications for women of color, who are typically the last hired and first fired, coming from transit-dependent communities where there may not be reasonable access, if any access, to legitimate reproductive health care facilities that are not crisis pregnancy centers, which are basically sham reproductive health facilities that are funded by the religious right and staffed with non-medical personnel. So all of these policies, the sonogram policies, the rape sonogram policies, the personhood amendments, the fetal homicide laws that criminalize drug-addicted, primarily working-class white and working-class women of color, as well as the defunding of Planned Parenthood and the defunding of birth control, really serve this narrative that valorizes a kind of new cult of true womanhood, based on the 19th century cult of true womanhood that extolled the virtues of purity, piety, domesticity, and chastity, reconsolidated the hierarchy of women by placing white women on a moral pedestal and denigrating women of color as amoral, hypersexual Jezebels. And this narrative was writ large recently in a national anti-abortion campaign that was launched in a few key cities, New York, Los Angeles, as well as Atlanta, funded by the far-right Radiance Foundation and the Latino Conservative Partnership, and featuring billboards that proclaimed, as you can see, that the most dangerous place for a black or Latino child is in the womb of these amoral, hypersexual, Jezebel, breeder, black and brown women who are sneaking out without the imprimatur of the state, organized religion, and patriarchy to get abortions. And this is concomitant with anti-undocumented immigrant legislation that has been spearheaded in the Southwest, in Arizona with SB 1070, as well as in the good old Bible Belt in Alabama and Georgia, that really pivots on a certain propagandistic narrative that Latinas are breeders of so-called anchor babies, sneaking over here to drop anchor baby citizens that will ultimately undermine American democracy and steal American jobs. And so this public policy backlash is buttressed by retrograde pop culture depictions of women of color that are exemplified by the blockbuster success of the film and the movie The Help, which came out last year. And The Help focused on the experiences of a young white woman growing up in 1960s Mississippi, launches her journalism career by glomming onto the stories and experiences of African American domestics, publishes this book to both notoriety and acclaim. And The Help manages to totally erase black women's seminal resistance to sexual terrorism and sexual violence and economic disenfranchisement in the deep Jim Crow South during this period, and substitutes instead the serviceable, very comforting, very technicolor, nostalgic vision of the asexual, God-fearing, eyes cast heavenward, mammy, domestic, whose entire life revolves around the moral uplift and redemption of her young white female charges. And so humanism from a woman of color standpoint is going to look quite different when we consider the cultural and historical trajectory whereby women of color have never ever been constructed as anyone's beauty ideal, as any font of preciousness and femininity. Humanism is going to look like Miani Giron, who is first year at Syracuse University, pre-med, first in her family to go to college, former Women's Leadership Project president, former foster care youth. And she had this to say about negative media representations and their impact on young women of color and their psyches. She said, the experience with going to Cal State University, Dominguez Hills, and talking to middle school students about gender issues and stereotypes really stood out to me. I see self-hatred amongst women in terms of abuse. A lot of women feel that you can't change it. Women internalize it and feel hopeless that they can't do anything about it because it's been going on for so long. At school, we see girls who are pregnant, and there are all these reality shows that promote pregnancy. There's a big difference between how white women are depicted and Black and Latina women. Black and Latina women are not shown doing positive things deserving of praise. There are a lot of magazines that show white women progressing and doing positive things, plus TV and magazines that show pregnant white women getting praise for having babies. And so Exhibit A is Bristol Palin, who is a reality TV star. She's gotten her own reality show by dint of being a teenage Palin who got knocked up as a single parent. And whenever I give these talks, I ask the audience, if you can think of a reality show that features a young woman of color, teenage, who had a baby as a teenager, became a reality show star by dint of this accomplishment, then I'm offering a free book. Okay, so I'll let that settle for a while. But this is something that really sticks in the craw of my students, as they watch these shows, Teen Mom and Pregnant at 16, and sees who gets valorized for their pregnancies. Humanism is going to look like Janet Silva, who is an undocumented young woman who could not go to the four-year college that she got admitted to because she is undocumented and couldn't afford the tuition, but has really blossomed into a dreamer activist and started her own AB 540 Dream Act club at her community college. And so she's a former WLP student. And she had this to say about the criminalization of youth at her high school. As the first bell rings, we are aggressively corralled into our classes like animals or inmates. Once in class, we are constantly told to, quote, just pass our classes. If just passing our classes is a message here, then there is no way that we're being prepared to become students at a four-year university. As I pause to think about how hard the Chicano civil rights activists fought to counter this type of treatment, I'm saddened that we, people of color, continue to have to climb the highest hurdles in society. And so Janet is making this connection between the dehumanization of young people within LAUSD and the Chicano student movement that's centered around a series of protests at East LA high schools in the 1960s over the lack of college access and the lack of bilingual education, disproportionate suspension and expulsion policies, as well as racist and culturally unresponsive instruction and curriculum. And 44 years after this uprising, the experiences of the Chicano youth are nakedly relevant to my students as they go to school day in and day out, and are wanted, and are searched, and are profiled, and are not so subtly told that they have a snowball's chance in hell to go to a four-year college, that they will, more than likely, at some phase of their either high school or, if they're lucky, community college career, be shunted through the school-to-prison pipeline because of racially disproportionate suspension, expulsion, opportunity transfer policies that really deeply impact African American students the most. As they come to campuses where the school culture promotes and normalizes sexual harassment against women of color and against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender students, and as they continue to open up textbooks where they do not see themselves, their communities, and their activist histories reflected in any meaningful way, if at all.